Our second passage comes to us this morning from 2 Samuel. And before I read it and begin preaching, last weekend I was at my denomination, the UCC, the greatest denomination. I was at my denomination's annual meeting and conference, and the Reverend Dr. Alice Hunt, who is the current executive director of the American Academy of Religion and the recent past president of Chicago Theological Seminary, preached on this same passage during our Saturday morning worship. So I felt kind of like I hit the jackpot. Now, I did not write down anything that she said, and I am not knowingly plagiarizing anything that she said, but the reason I mention her name is because her sermon did impact me, and so I feel like I should at least give her vocal credit and thank her for the blessing of her words last week. I'll be starting in 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 1. I'll read the first 5 verses of that chapter, and then we'll jump ahead to verse 26, and I'll read through the end of the chapter through the first 9 verses of chapter 12. This is a story that may be familiar to many of you, the story of King David and Bathsheba. In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. One evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, "She is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite." Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. Now she was purifying herself from her monthly uncleanness. Then she went back home. The woman conceived and sent word to David saying, "I am pregnant." The lectionary skips the next passages until verse 26, but in that in-between time, David brings Bathsheba's husband home from battle in hopes that Uriah might lie with Bathsheba, therefore convincing others that the baby is his, but that does not happen. So then David assures that Uriah is killed in battle, and die he does. When Uriah's wife heard that her husband was dead, she mourned for him. After the time of mourning was over, David had her brought to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing David had done displeased the Lord. The Lord sent Nathan to David. When he came to him, he said, "There were 2 men in a certain town, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb he had bought. He raised it, and it grew up with him and his children. It shared his food, drank from his cup, and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. Now a traveler came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler who had come to him. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for the one who had come to him." David burned with anger against the man and said to Nathan, "As surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this must die. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over because he did such a thing and had no pity." Then Nathan said to David, "You are the man. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave your master's house to you and your master's wives into your arms. I gave you all Israel and Judah, and if all this had been too little, I would have given you even more. Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and took his wife to be your own. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now, therefore, the sword will never depart from your house because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite. to be your own. Majestic figures of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Theodore Roosevelt, and Abraham Lincoln, surrounded by the beauty of the Black Hills of South Dakota, tell the story of the birth, growth, development, and preservation of this country. That is the first line of the National Park Service webpage devoted to the Mount Rushmore National Memorial. And the first time I saw Mount Rushmore, sometime in my very early 20s, I would have affirmed that statement. It is majestic. It does tell the story of the birth and development of this country. Absolutely, that is Mount Rushmore. But then sometime in my late 20s, as a youth pastor here traveling out to South Dakota with our youth group, I went to the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation to serve the Oglala Lakota people through the Remember organization, one of our national mission partners. And I've never thought about Mount Rushmore the same since then. Mount Rushmore does tell a story, but it certainly isn't the only story. It isn't a complete story. It is the story of the most powerful people group in the story, so the one that we hear the most. But if we think we're getting the whole story, we should look again. Mount Rushmore does not tell the story of the Oglala Lakota Nation. The Black Hills are sacred to the Lakota people. The region is central to their identity and where their stories of origin take place. While important to other tribes as well, it was the Lakota who had sacred claim to the Black Hills because of its centrality to their ancestry and heritage. The site that we now know as Mount Rushmore, named after a prominent New York lawyer during an expedition in 1885, had before that time been known to the Lakota people as Tunkasila Sakpi, translated 6 grandfathers. And as 6 grandfathers, it was part of the route of the spiritual journey of Lakota elder Nicholas Black Elk. In 1868, the Laramie Treaty, an agreement between the Lakota Nation and the U.S. government, designated not just 6 grandfathers, but the surrounding region, 20 million acres of land, to be, and I quote, set apart for the absolute and undisturbed use and occupation of the Indians. But gold was discovered in the Black Hills in 1874, and the land promptly seized by the U.S. government. The faces of the presidents were carved into Mount Rushmore beginning in 1927, with the work continuing for 15 years. In 1980, the Supreme Court ruled that the federal government had indeed taken the Black Hills from the Lakota people unconstitutionally. But rather than return the land designated by the 1868 treaty, the Claims Commission awarded a financial sum equal to the land's value in 1877 plus interest. The Lakota have refused to accept payment for their sacred 6 grandfathers and the surrounding land. Oglala spiritual leader Rick Two Dogs explains the decision by saying, "All our origin stories go back to this place. We have a spiritual connection to the Black Hills that can't be sold. I don't think I could face the Creator with an open heart if I ever took money for it." So when the Parks Service tells us that Mount Rushmore tells the story of the birth, growth, development, and preservation of this country, I just don't buy that as the full story anymore. What I know now has changed my understanding of that national memorial from when I first saw it, because the full story is one that involves an abuse of power over the less powerful, which brings us to the story of David and Bathsheba. Going back to the first times I heard this narrative, and since then, It was almost always explained to me, and I'm sure that in the past in teaching young people, I have also explained it this way, as being an example of David being a flawed person and God choosing him anyway. David is flawed, and God used him. We are all flawed, and God can use us. That's good news. And that explanation is part of the story. And it's an explanation that may be a helpful way to interpret what happens between David and Bathsheba. But it is not the whole story, and it is not hearing all the voices involved. David, the king of Israel, sees Bathsheba taking a ritual bath and decides that he wants her. After finding out she has a husband who is away, he sends people to go and get her and bring her to him where he lies with her. When Bathsheba sends word she is pregnant, David tries to trick her husband into thinking the child is his, and when that doesn't work, has him killed in battle, then takes Bathsheba as his wife before the child is born, so he comes out smelling like a rose. But Uriah the soldier is dead. And there is the screaming silence of a voice that is central to the story. Bathsheba. The silence of Bathsheba is deafening. Our passage this morning concluded with a parable told by Nathan, a prophet and friend to David. Nathan tells the parable of the rich man who will not share out of his vast abundance with the visitor, but instead takes the one lamb owned by the man who is already poor. David recognizes the wrong in that parable and burns with anger against the rich man. Once he realizes the wrong, Nathan forces David to come face to face with his own privilege when Nathan cries boldly at last, "You are the man." It is after he is confronted by Nathan that David writes Psalm 51, the psalm of repentance that Drew read earlier. Nathan speaks truth to power for those who couldn't speak, and in the process makes David aware of his own privilege and his own abuse of power, and in turn how I understand myself and my responsibility. The story of David's taking of Bathsheba is often labeled by the headings in our Bibles as adultery, but adultery requires two consenting adults. The story of David's taking of Bathsheba is the story of a person of privilege wielding that privilege for personal gain. It is the story of an abuse of power over a soldier who was lied to and a woman who had no voice and no power. Just like learning about the Lakota people changed how I understand Mount Rushmore, so too did opening my eyes to the ways in which power and privilege are wielded in society to the detriment of those who are less powerful or powerless, and to the continued advantage of those who enjoy privileges bestowed upon some, broaden the ways I understand this narrative. I am particularly aware of power used over women. The news and experience I know of and have known make that impossible for me to ignore. Most of us are a combination of privileged power and stifled silence. But for those for whom their privilege far outweighs their suppression, they need Nathans to call it out, to yell, "You are the one." They need people who are aware of the dangers of the imbalance of power and how it is those at the bottom who are continuously struck down by those at the top so things don't change. This does not mean people in places of power and privilege don't face struggles. It means that society and culture are not constructed in a way that keeps them silent or struggling. I stand before you a white, straight, middle-class, American Christian. I need to come to reason with my own privilege and my own power. I have all kinds of privilege based on my race, orientation, class, education, and more. So when I hear Nathan tell David, "You are the man," I must own my privilege and the power that comes with it. I must hear, "I am the one." But I am not only privilege. I am a woman, and still now, even today, some days it feels like especially today, my womanness carries with it some stifling of voice, some oppression of opportunity. Certainly, for Bathsheba, her gender silenced her. She had no power and no voice. And that is not a story that is confined to the Old Testament. Just Friday, I dropped off 25 care packages at MSU's sexual assault program office that our campus ministry students had assembled the Sunday before. The care packages will be given to students who seek out the services of the sexual assault program at MSU. They accepted them gratefully, and when I told them there were 75 more coming soon, they acknowledged that we couldn't make too many. They see so many students that they go through those care packages very quickly. I learned from the Lakota story of the 6 grandfathers, of the stories of those across the community, country, and world whose rights are not honored, whose voices are stifled, whose stories are not heard because of the powers that be. Let us be Nathans for them. When wealthy, powerful, and privileged men speak of this being a scary time to be a man in this country, let us feel compelled to use our voices to speak for the 1 in 4 women in this country who are survivors of sexual assault, knowing that most of those stories are never given voice. Let us not be afraid to say, "You are the one," to the powerful. And let us also let those words speak to us and shape how we live in God's world. Christ's ministry was unarguably one that cared for the silenced and the powerless, his heart always with the least among us. As disciples of Christ, we are the ones. We are the ones who should be aware of the privilege and power in this world, even our own, and stand with those who are wounded or silenced by it. Amen.